Welcome, everyone. My name is Catherine Magnuson. I'm an Associate Director at the Institute for Research on Poverty. And on behalf of the Wisconsin Hope Lab colleagues and my WISCAPE colleagues, I am pleased to welcome you here. We're having a discussion today between two of our esteemed affiliates, Stephen Durloff, who is a professor of economics, and Sarah Goldrick-Rab, a professor of sociology and educational policy studies. The discussion is being moderated by Dr. Stephanie Robert, School of Social Work. At this point, I'm going to hand it off to Stephanie, who will tell you a bit more about the format.
Good afternoon. So the format we're going to use today is we're going to start with a short clip of the president announcing the initiative, and then Sarah will have 15 minutes to make a statement. Then Stephen will have 20 minutes to make a statement and provide a response. And then Sarah will have 5 more minutes for a response. And then after that, I will moderate an open Q&A from all of you. And I'll remind you this at the time, but we're taping this, so don't ask your question until I bring you the mic.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. I'm going to talk about why I believe that what the president did in that announcement is worthy of support. And first, I want to start by saying that I asked Stephen to join me in this conversation today because I believe that any proposal worth making is worthy of sifting and winnowing. And that here at the University of Wisconsin, that is one of our finest traditions and something that we must uphold, and something that I believe that we demonstrate to the rest of the country as to sort of how it's done. So I'm hoping that what we're going to do here today as colleagues is to work through what we believe are the merits and the problems with this plan. And I believe that this will be informative not only for those here today, but for those around the country who are trying to figure out exactly what this means that the president just said and what the next steps might or could or should be. So I know that, Catherine, I'm gonna pick up just one little logistic and let you all know that we were originally going to be live streaming today, which we could not do because there's a just scheduled legislative hearing down the road there. But we do have people following us on Twitter, and if you are tweeting, you should tweet at FreeCC, #FreeCC. That's my Twitter handle up there in case you want to use that. Okay, so let me go over briefly the proposal as it's currently known today, at least from the White House, and note that there are forthcoming proposals from multiple senators who will be bringing out, I think, variations on this, but we're going to primarily focus on this today. As the president said, the plan here is to make 2 years, and he's spoken about it in terms of years, of community college free. What that means is a lowering of the upfront price of attending. It's a lowering of the sticker price, or what we in financial aid would refer to as a first dollar scholarship, rather than one that, for example, in Tennessee is a last dollar model, which essentially applies all existing financial aid and then only covers the remaining need that exists, if it does exist, in order to make it free. Okay? And I can discuss in greater detail why those two things are very different, but this is a first dollar program. The second thing is that in order to be eligible for this program, the students have to enroll at least half time. That may sound like a minimal amount, but it's worth noting that a substantial fraction of community college students today do not even enroll at half-time, so that's a requirement here. It is not a means-tested proposal, at least not as it was originally made. It's not intended to require an application, and therefore it could, in theory, apply to Bill Gates' children were they to pursue a community college education. That said, I've got a little asterisk in there because at some point, someone slipped in a $200,000 income cap into this that folks have tried to stay away from ever since that's been mentioned. So I think it'll be clear to you today that I would oppose the introduction of such a cap because it moves away from a universal model. Continued receipt, although not initial eligibility, and those are very different things. Continued receipt of the free program requires a student to obtain a 2.5 grade point average. For those of you that are unfamiliar with today's standards, the federal Pell Grant program requires attaining a 2.0 GPA. And there's a growing body of evidence that approximately 25 to 40% of all first-year students, not only those receiving the Pell Grant, actually struggle to meet the 2.0 criteria as it stands now. In terms of which colleges would be eligible, the president talked about high-quality community colleges, and what he was referring to were those that offered transfer programs or high-quality occupational programs that lead to degrees and certificates. Now, here in Wisconsin, we don't have community colleges, so I want to note that under this definition, it is very likely that our UW colleges, which are two-year branch campuses that have transfer, and our Wisconsin technical colleges, which very demonstrably have strong returns to their occupational programs, both of which very likely to be included in such a program. Finally, the way that the funding is supposed to work for this program, and I'll talk later about the pay for, it's supposed to be 3/4 covered by the federal government and 1/4 covered by the states. For those of you that don't know how community college funding currently works, the most important thing you need to know is that the vast majority of funding for undergraduate education at today's community colleges comes from states and local entities. It comes from local taxpayer support, bond referenda, and that sort of thing. So this would be a major change. To preview where I'm going to head with my argument, I'm going to make 2 points. I believe that this is a proposal worthy of support for 2 reasons. First, I believe that it is likely to have significant, substantial positive impacts on college attendance and completion that will primarily accrue to those from low to moderate income families and therefore increase equity in higher education outcomes. Secondly, I'm also going to argue that this is a good policy to pursue at this time and is worthy of investment with current resources. And that's going to have to do with today's socioeconomic and political contexts, which I believe must be accounted for when assessing the viability of any policy. Further, I'm going to talk a bit about time horizons. Now, I'm going to tell you a bit about myself for those of you that don't know who I am, because as one of our speakers talked about in IRP several months ago, Chuck Mansky, of course, our conclusions reflect both our data and our assumptions. And I want to lay out a bit about my assumptions in case you're not familiar with them. My work has been devoted to studying undergraduates for the last 15 years. I haven't only focused on low-income students, but I've predominantly focused on them. I've examined their transfer behaviors, their college choices, and yes, their finances. And at the Wisconsin Hope Lab, which I now direct, we are entirely focused with issues of college affordability and seeking any which way possible to try to reduce the very strong link that exists today between family income and the chances of attaining a college degree. I am a sociologist by training, and I tend to think of things in that context. I tend to think about intersections between institutions. So for example, I tend to think about education policies as social policies. And I like to think about this historical moment not just in terms of what's happening today in education, but also what's happening today in workforce policy and with regard to the rest of the social safety net. I also believe that my thinking today reflects both quantitative and qualitative research. For example, my team has conducted rigorous experimental studies of the impacts of need-based financial aid, but we are also in the field right now with a multi-sited ethnographic study of undergraduates. And so a lot of what I think about how students will respond to this policy is also grounded in that sort of foundational research. Finally, the way that I think especially about this particular moment reflects my engagement with local, state, and federal policymakers, including the Domestic Policy Council, around these particular issues, and a judgment call that we'll all have to discuss about what the current situation looks like and its viability for a pursuit of a policy at this time. I did release a paper last year with my colleague Nancy Kendall, who's really sadly away at a conference today and wishes she could be here. It is referenced up there in case you want to see the kinds of arguments we lay out. They are aligned but not entirely reflected in the proposal that we're discussing today. There are some very important distinctions that we could talk about in Q&A, but Stephen and I also agreed that we would focus on the president's proposal. But I want to note that everything I'm saying here today really has been strongly influenced by those relationships and conversations with Nancy. And again, I really wish she could be here. So the first thing that I think we need to get on the table is that costs of attending community college today are, I would argue, definitely an impediment to community college students. And I think this has to be laid out in some detail because there's a common assumption out there that our community colleges are already very affordable. And as you might have heard, tuition is already very low. In fact, there are some who will say that net tuition is virtually free today for low-income students. Now, I think these are reasonable things to state, but in some ways, they reflect an understanding of higher education financing that is about 10 years old. The Great Recession did a great deal of harm to college affordability in this country. So the data that I have here is the most recent available. It is from 2012, 2013. And what I'm showing you is the net price by federal definition of attending community college. And what that means is the cost of tuition, fees, and living expenses, as well as books, supplies, and transportation on an annual basis, minus all grants and scholarships. This is what students have to come up with in order to actually be in school. What you can see here is that even for low-income students, okay, and I'm showing you the average family income for those in the federal data set for what I'm calling low income, and you could see for dependent students who are of traditional age, it's about $21,000 a year. To attend community college in this country, they face a net price of $8,300 a year. That amounts to 40% of their family's income. Okay, and you can see it goes up from there, but it's worth noting that for moderate and even middle income families, those percentages get rather high, and they are astoundingly high for independent students, who are actually the majority of community college students today. The average entering age at community colleges is 28 years old. For a low-income student, they are facing a net price of attending community college today of over $11,000 a year. Okay, what happened? States disinvested. I think we're all familiar here today in Wisconsin with that phenomenon. Real family income declined. And our investments in grant aid, while we have increased the Pell over time, have not increased at nearly the same rate as the cost of college going. What do students do when faced with this? Our research indicates they do a variety of things. But most importantly, they borrow student loans just to attend a community college. And in fact, they cannot cover $8,000 or more a year with federal loans because the maximum is $5,500. So they turn to federal loans, they work, and in fact, today, 75% of today's undergraduates are working, many of them at night, many of them during the graveyard shift, and they're making changes to their academic course-taking behaviors as a result. We are seeing literally talent loss. So if we compare two cohorts of high school graduates from 1992 and 2004, I'm going to focus here on the academically prepared, and what these changes in the red bars show you is that increasing numbers of them are foregoing college, not going anywhere. That's a major change. That's a reversal of trends from prior decades. Secondly, for those who enter community college, you're seeing their persistence rates decline for those from low to moderate income families, and again, here I'm holding constant high academic levels of preparation. Okay, so these are trends that I'm concerned about. Now, what's likely to happen to these if we go with President Obama's proposal? First, we have to admit there's been nothing like this done before. Okay? I believe that the CUNY early 1970s, which we could discuss in Q&A, is the best approximation. I don't think what's happened in California is really very telling in terms of what this policy would look like or do. But there are three types of research studies that we can examine. And in advance of this, we shared a list together of those studies and agreed upon that body of evidence. And you can see here the kinds of things that we've examined. Now, importantly, I'm talking about a grand total of about 10 studies. Okay? And 2 of them came out in the last year. So I want to highlight those 2. I think they're the best and most relevant evidence. One of them is conducted by an economics doctoral student, Jeff Jennings, at the University of Texas, Austin, under Sandy Black. He's examined recent changes in Texas community college pricing, and he identifies that a $1,000 decrease in the cost of attending a community college increased enrollment by about 7 percentage points. That's just the enrollment margin, however. He also finds that more students are likely to actually complete college, and very importantly, to even attain bachelor's degrees. So there is a literature that suggests some risk to students being diverted, for example, to community colleges instead of four-year schools. His evidence suggests that while that risk exists, we still see an uptick in bachelor's degree attainment. Secondly, a nice paper that was presented this year at the Association of Educational Finance and Policy looks at the Knox Achieves program, which predates the Tennessee Promise, and again finds, admittedly using a less rigorous design that doesn't deal with unobserved heterogeneity nearly as well, they find very substantial increases in high school graduation rates, community college attendance rates, and college persistence rates associated with the offer of free community college. Importantly, even for students who did not see their price reduced, which suggests that messaging matters. Okay? Now, I believe that these estimates may be overstated. On the other hand, because they were not done at scale, these programs, they may in fact be understated. I apparently only have 1 minute remaining, so I will just say the following about the likely impacts and address the rest after Steve speaks. I believe that we're also going to see other very important effects beyond the student level. I believe that we will see stabilization in the funding sources for community colleges, which are currently counter-cyclical just like their enrollment. As soon as they need money, the funding for them currently goes down. That should change. I believe it will improve school quality, partly as a result and partly because one reason we see poor outcomes at today's community colleges is the significant resource constraints of their students and their faculty's difficulty in dealing with those constraints. I also believe that introducing the state maintenance of effort requirement, which comes under this policy, will help to stabilize and perhaps reduce costs at these institutions. And I'll stop there and turn it over to Steve.
I have to admit I was a little intimidated by the Obama clip because I didn't hear it quite correctly. And when he said he wanted to persuade Congress, I think he said persuade economists. But all right. First of all, let me thank Sarah for both inviting me and initiating this. And I very much think of this as a structured discussion. In other words, it's not a debate in that we basically have somewhat different ways we're going to assess certain ideas, certain pieces of empirical evidence, think about policy. And the objective, I hope, is that it will simply further thinking through policies that facilitate the enhancement of opportunity. And so from really what I want to do is simply explain to you why someone who I think shares most of the ethical commitments of Sarah would come to a different conclusion about this particular policy. And I want to emphasize this, and I'm going to say that more than once, that even though obviously I think I'm right or I wouldn't take the position, that doesn't mean Sarah's wrong. In other words, the objective is I want to describe a way I think about policy evaluation, for better or worse, identify where the disagreements are. Some will simply be philosophical. Others will have to do with the way we interpret empirical evidence. Other ones are going to have to do with what we know going into the exercise. That doesn't help me, by the way. But and so that all I would like to communicate at the end is why I came to a negative conclusion. Okay, so. First of all, this is the first place where we actually have something of a disagreement, and that is, what does it mean to support a proposal? That isn't a vacuous question, and the reason for that is, if you ask the question, do I want to see enhanced opportunities for education with a disadvantage, I'd say yes, but I think that anybody would say, any reasonable person would say the same thing, and so really, when somebody asks about a policy, since of course the commitment doesn't entail any particular policy, I think that there's three things that have to be done. The first is simply to evaluate the merits in what I'll say in isolation, in other words, on its own terms. The second is to consider alternative plans with similar proximate goals, and what I mean by that is the details matter. Mm-hmm. And then the third is to think about opportunity costs, and what I mean by that is that resources are going to be employed for this particular program, and we have to ask whether or not, given finite budgets and the like, is this an appropriate way to proceed. So the only comment I want to make going into that is to notice that the size of the program isn't trivial. In other words, if it's $12 billion per year, we can compare it to some rather large programs that have fundamental social welfare programs in which orders of magnitude are not all that different. And so I do want to just say that, to stipulate that we are talking about a substantial amount of money, and it's not something that I think that we can necessarily ignore the issue associated with resources. All right, now opportunity cost is a little bit of a dangerous argument. And the reason for that is that if I said to her, oh, Sarah, why do you support this? Because I want to spend all the money on vaccinations in the third world, it would be impossible for her to justify a policy as the best imaginable. In contrast, I just don't think we want to say that the opportunity cost is zero. So I think what it places me in is a position I have to give something that's reasonable there. And so what I'm going to claim is reasonable. The way I want to think about it is I have $60 billion. Miraculously, the Congress has said to you, help the disadvantaged. Where would I place the money? And in order to make that argument, so that, in other words, I'm going to stipulate the resources simply exist. I'm not going to talk about where they came from. Furthermore, I claim that that won't be sufficient either. I have to have a pretty big difference between this policy and other ones. In other words, if I can say, well, there's some epsilon difference between them, that's not a sufficient argument against it. All right, and so, I hope I'll have time to get to this, and this is where Sarah, having 15 versus 20, had a problem, is I want to say something about the opportunity cost with respect to politics. In other words, the issue, it's one thing to advocate the policies abstractly, another question is feasibility. Okay. Second thing I want to say is a background issue is how to think about policy evaluation. I really want two things on the table. One is we have to have some vision of how the outcomes we care about are determined. And that means that we can have substantive social science disagreements, we can have evidentiary disagreements and the like. And then the second, of course, we have to specify the evaluative criteria. And so there's a lot of algebra one can put in something like that. And so you think of some outcomes, they're going to depend on the policy. This is actually very similar to her slide. It's assumptions, data, and what I call the unknowns. That's the things we agree that we have to recognize are simply uncertain at the time the policy is made. Now, that is logically distinct, and notice I put in data there. That's very important. In other words, the facts better matter. I like to say they don't have to matter, but we would want them to. And then the second thing, of course, is that we'll have some notion of how we evaluate the policies in light of this uncertainty. And so what the algebra says is the following, and that is we have to have stances on the nature of that uncertainty. And the easiest way to think about it is there's some probability density associated with it. Now, why would that matter? Suppose I said to her, I'm absolutely sure Homo economicus, as taught in Econ 101, is how people behave. That would be my assumption. Sarah was allowed to say, you know what? I don't like that assumption. That should be in the unknowns. And she could take another stance, Homo socialis, or she could take the reasonable position is we don't want to be dogmatic about the assumptions on behavior. All right, and so that's a theme that will come up again, is that issue. Final general comment, and so this is where we can disagree. We're going to have some differences in assumptions. And as I said, they'll have to do with commitments. They're going to have to do with how we think about models. The second is going to have to do with the way we think about what's unknown, and that's going to have something to do with differences in our empirical philosophies. It's also going to have something to do with what I'm going to call prior beliefs. In other words, we go into the exercise, the analysis, knowing things. And the final thing is that there may be something about the differences in evaluative criteria. So that's kind of where we are. And so let me put Cromwell's rule on the table. Says, I beseech you in the bells of Christ, think it possible that you may be mistaken. And I put this on because it would be wrong to interpret anything I say too dogmatically. In other words, these is what I think I have good reasons to believe these things, but they are all subject to refutation. Okay. Final thing in background, and I really probably use all the time in background, is the way that I think about community college, and I'll say, and Sarah does too, is that it's in the context of a life course. Individuals are proceeding from birth through their life course trajectories, and there's a particular moment called community college, or possible range of moments. And a simplification for that is to sort of think about, and this is not going to address the issue of people starting at 28, is that you have people going from birth to age 18. At age 18, there's three things they can do. One is enter the labor force. The second would be go to community college. The other is go to four-year college. All right? Obviously, the richness has to do with movements back and forth. And so that's the issue. And then what happens next is employment, life satisfaction. And so what that means is that we can think about paths associated with outcomes. In other words, there's one path that says graduate from high school, go to a four-year college, enter the labor force. Another path could be GED, two-year college, enter the labor force, so on and so forth. And so at the end, one ends up, even with this oversimplification of the fact that you can move back and forth and do things at different ages, with a fairly complicated vision of what's going to be happening. Okay? And so I put this on the table because this is going to have to do with kind of how, again, how I think about the problem and how I want to interpret the proposal. So you might say, well, so what are the ethical commitments? These are really not going to be controversial. I want opportunities to be rich, and I'm sure she strongly disagrees. And then the second is some notion of a flourishing life. And so I've distinguished those because the first one is non-consequentialist. I care about the rules being relatively fair. Okay, so how do I evaluate the policy, its effects? And so I want to call the micro level effect. How do I think about it? And that is, I have this life course, and there's a particular moment or a particular choice called go to community college where the price has been changed. It's been set to zero, the tuition price, not the net price. Okay, that's the change, and I want to think about life courses with this particular price having been altered. So, from that perspective, if I sort of say, why do I want to use econo jargon? One reason is that when we think about price effects, they sort of have two sides to them. One's called an income effect. If I lower the prices of something, I can buy more, my opportunities to buy things are enhanced. That's a little bit tricky in terms of defending the proposal because there's a fairness issue. Because if I want to help disadvantaged people, I could argue that why should I only help the disadvantaged ones that elect to go to community college? Now, I might do that because I care about education. That's a separate point. And that's called the substitution effect. In other words, that there's an idea of changing relative opportunities with respect to the implied cost to them. All right? And so that's really the distinction I want to have on the table. Now, here's the thought experiment. And this is, again, notice I keep simplifying and getting rid of richness. Suppose that what I really want is to have as many four-year college graduates as possible. It's not fair because it ignores a first-order role of the community colleges, which is training for certificates. But I'm just putting this on as a way to think. So what are the paths? We could imagine that because of the policy, people who would have entered the labor force go to community college. That's kind of the one effect. Another one could be that, and this is one that I don't know if it's been discussed very much, but if the requirements for community college are different from four-year colleges, you could imagine that people who were going to graduate would shift to GEDs because that's sufficient for community college. As a separate question about that's evidence, I merely say that is a logical possibility. A third possibility is that high school graduates or GED recipients shift from four-year to two-year colleges. The reason I put these on the table is the first one is sort of thinking about the intuition's clearest there. The other two are a little bit less obvious, and they have an implication, which is the possibility that if what I really care about is the four-year graduation rates, maybe it would be counterproductive. In other words, but strange enough, by changing the relative price, by focusing on this one node, we may not be enhancing the objectives that we care about with respect to the life course. Okay, and that's part of where we're going to disagree, is how strong the evidence is for these different types of factors. Okay, none of them, there's no evidence that's dispositive. There are going to be judgments here. All right, so there's background. So let me just say, why do I worry about these things? One piece of evidence is it's pretty clear that there's a big difference between completing high school and the GED in terms of the knowledge that people have and how they do in labor markets. And so this table gives some evidence of that. Also, it's a lot harder, you're much less likely to complete schooling 2 or 4 if you have a GED. So I just want that on the table as something to think about. Second comment is that there's also, and Sarah mentioned this, there's considerable evidence that that completion rates at community college are not terribly high. Conditional completion rates are for 4-year degrees are also pretty low, and that's going to be important in thinking about the evidence she gave, like the Denning study. All right, so, but those are just going to be 2 ideas on the table. So when we talk about evidence, so I picked 6 studies. So the background was when Sarah initiated, I asked her if she could send me a set of studies to make sure that she knows the literature, and I don't, that I knew some of it, so to be fair, that I was kind of on board with her in terms of what we're going to talk about. And so I picked, I didn't do great, I did get Denning, but here were 6 examples of studies that find something about community college enrollment associated with a $1,000 drop in tuition. I want to be a little bit careful that in some of these studies it had to do with any college, but for our purposes that's sufficient. What this quasi-experimental evidence means is that there's a case where there's a change in the price, and see what behaviors manifested from it. And so that's important if you wanted to net out those 3 factors I gave before. So they were all positive. That doesn't look good for me. Okay. However, and the serious point's the following, and that is, I think the devil's in the details in these. Just to give an example, the Denning paper, which has gotten a lot of attention, the basic idea is that there were different communities that voted to join community college districts, and that vote constituted 2 things. One, you're eligible for a lower tuition because you're a member of the district, and second, you raise your taxes to help support it. All right, so from my perspective as a social scientist, this doesn't work for me as an experiment, to be blunt. And the reason for that is that there's always this deep issue of self-selection. Okay, you probably all know that if you're over the age of 70 and you go into hospital, it's much more likely you will die than if you don't. But that's because sick people go to the hospital. That's self-selection in a very extreme form. This is a more subtle type of self-selection, which is we have this dynamic state in which community districts are more or less, and communities are more or less dynamic, and these communities are choosing to join community college districts. Self-selection is logically distinct from so-called fixed effects. It's an error that appears in a lot of empirical work, so you can't be blamed for that. But nevertheless, that, in my judgment, is a first-order reason that I read the evidence with skepticism. And then the final thing is just to make the observation that, notice, they aren't the same policy. This is a self-financing one, so to speak. And so one has to just keep that in mind. This doesn't mean it's a bad paper, or it simply is why I don't put much evidentiary weight on policy. All right, I'm going to go much faster. I'm going to skip 2 other papers. I only picked economists, by the way. I do want to say one final thing about the data. There are controversies in social science about empirics. And these papers also tend to study from things that I think are important. I mentioned 1 and 3. The first one is these statistical analyses have functional forms in them typically, and they use something called a linear probability model, which you can say, who cares? Linear probability models ignore something important, which is the interactions between things in terms of the probabilities of things occurring. The second thing is, a third one is called model uncertainty. The reason I focus on that is that these are studies that still have control variables in them. You put in race, ethnicity, measures of socioeconomic status. None of these are their theories as to which variables go in or how to measure them. And in time, case after case after case, it's turned out that there's fragility to these types of results. That doesn't mean this one's fragile, but I'm saying when I read this paper in isolation, that's going to be an issue with me. Okay. So, I'm going to skip over, given the time. I'm really screwing up now. Let me see if I can go back and explain what it is I'm skipping. No, I can't. It's only one way forward. There's a separate issue, which is what happens to people in community college and whether or not it indeed has this inhibiting effect about the so-called displacement effect, et cetera. I have some fairly harsh criticisms of a book by Attewell and Lavin that looks at the CUNY system, and at some level, it's a simple criticism. They're looking at women who enrolled in CUNY against a nationally representative sample of women. And the bottom line is all the women in the CUNY study, they enrolled in a CUNY. And that self-selection is not addressed in the book. Now, I put all of that on the table, and I want to end with one important comment. The logic that I gave you may or may not be empirically important. And that's where I have a huge comparative disadvantage in the analysis. I don't do ethnographic work. I'm not conversant with the individuals in the system. So if Sarah came back and wanted to make an argument that the type of selection I'm worried about as a factual matter is not first order, you should believe her. I can merely tell you, this is where I am on theory. There are other contexts where self-selection matters with respect to disadvantage. Job training programs, it's turned out the effects are largely illusory. And it was just a matter of the more ambitious people enrolled in them. But at the end of the day, that's why you can have principled disagreements. Okay, the macro level, I'm going to skip. I want to make a comment about segregation. And that is, I worry about plans in general which might enhance segregation of institutions by socioeconomic status. If we were debating the Goldrab-Kendall plan, I'd spend the whole time on that because of the fact that she didn't want to fund the privates. Now, that doesn't mean I'd win the argument or anything. The point is that's what I would focus on. And so I put on the table some concern that as the Bill Gates children start to decide where to go when they know they're going to be more disadvantaged people who may are going to have weaker educational backgrounds. That may enhance socioeconomic segregation. And in other work, I've called this a memberships theory of inequality, where you should think about individuals going through these different groupings in life: family, school, neighborhood, at school, later college, and all of that. And we have to be extremely careful about that. Okay. So what about alternative plan formulations? I think that, any economist will say, well, why are you paying for the inframarginal people, the people who aren't going to be affected? So if there's no political consequence and it was easy to handle that, you might think that that was a good idea. And so if I said to you, well, what I want is a tuition schedule, you might say to me, well, is that big enough to justify not opposing the plan? I think it depends. So I think relative to the first best, which is Golder Grab Kendall, no, because the qualitatively it's in the same spirit. Now, I guess I'll tease Sarah and ask, because one of my son suggested this to me, well, what if you had free tuition for 2 years, but it's only once 2 years are completed? You notice what that would do? It set all the incentives to get the 4-year degree. So I put that on the table, that might be a more radical change. Now, an opportunity cost, what I want to say is that there is, I think, very strong evidence of high returns to early childhood investment. Programs between ages 3 and 5, and again, on the slides, which will be posted, give the evidence there. Now, you want more response to this might be, well, there's something special about zero tuition. That's not so clear to me. And the reason I say that is that sometimes it's good if people pay money because it raises their expectations for what they're going to get. I want those community college students to feel that they are shareholders and are going to bug the teachers if they don't pay enough attention to them, so on and so forth. Okay, there's an issue of loans and grants, and let me move all of that down here to make 2 comments. Actually, why don't we do universalism just in the Q&A since you didn't get to that. All right, so let me, since I can't operate this thing, you should feel sorry for me. Okay, so the bottom line, all right. The bottom line is that on the face, I don't see the evidentiary good reasons to think the evidence is very strong, kind of on the expected effect. My preferences, I'm very worried about these, what I'll say, possible adverse effects, be they segregation or displacement. That doesn't mean I have strong evidence on them, but my preferences are such that any evidence really worries me. Mm-hmm. The third comment is I do see different ways to structure the policy that I think are non-trivial. Mm-hmm. And the final thing, and this is where we actually do have a little bit of an ethical difference, I think, which is that my view on opportunity is not equalization, is that people have a certain reasonable chance. So, and you might say, well, leaving aside measurement, the bottom line, to be blunt, is that what I want is I don't like downward mobility. I think if parents are affluent, it's great they can lock their kids in. What I'm worried about is simply that if the parents aren't affluent, that there's a substantial probability that the children can succeed. And that just it turns out that that distinction is not trivial. It says you structure the policies a bit differently. I'm sorry I went too long. Okay, and I had some lovely quotes from Mill and Lincoln, but I don't have time for them. All right. Okay.
We'd originally discussed making this 2 hours, and now I don't know. I think that...
And I forgot.
I apologize. No, let's see. I did that wrong. Okay, so let me just think for a minute here about a few things. Responses. Okay, so first I'm going to just make a few points that don't quite go in the order of my slides because I think that they're relevant. So on the empirical issues, I think that when you get a chance, and we'll both provide our slides, right, so that they can look at it. I think that it's important. I highlighted Denning, but of course it is one study in a set of studies, and I think that the rest of the slide actually showed you that the vast majority of the alternative studies that we might look at go in the same direction. In other words, they tend to find that lowering the costs associated with the community colleges do tend to find similar effects. And I want to note that one of the studies that was on the quasi-experimental study slide was actually an experiment. And there's a set of these, and there's another one that Drew Anderson and I are in the midst of right now that I don't think, I didn't want to put into this body of evidence since it's not even a working paper yet. But in other words, there's experimental work and there's quasi-experimental work. But I think that the most important thing to say at this point, and then to move forward with my slides, is that I think that, of course, the empirical evidence is a piece of the decision here around supporting a policy, right? And I believe that many times we are faced with decisions, and I think Washington is faced with decisions that we would love as academics to believe are entirely informed by how rich and robust the body of evidence is at the moment, and yet at the same time, in some ways, it's not the only thing that's relevant. And I think this is really very much one of those cases. I think that we can all see out there the cries from families for some sort of relief when it comes to their concerns about not only whether they're going to fall down in terms of mobility, but whether there is any point in teaching their children that it's important to finish high school, that it's important to get academically prepared for college, if in fact we're going to see in the future what we're seeing today. And I want to be clear about what we're seeing today. We're seeing two things. We're seeing very hardworking programs and people encouraging students to get ready for college, successfully getting them in the door, and watching them drop out after a year or two as literally there's a lot of college left at the end of the money. Okay? And this is something we're seeing over and over. Every practitioner reports it. The number one stated reason for dropping out is money. We can assume that some of that is tied up in academics, but we actually cannot separate those two as cleanly as we would like to, both either in the data or in reality, since the academic performance that we are seeing, especially in community colleges, can in fact be predicted in many ways by the lack of time that they have to devote to their studies because they are trying to cover their other costs. I think the other concern that we have is we have a rising number of people who have attained some college and no degree. And most importantly, they have debt. And the consequences of that debt, I think, are very poorly estimated to this point. I don't think that there's a study out there that really is very convincing that there's a causal effect of the debt, so much as there's a causal effect of the lack of affordability. But the concern that I have, and that I do believe the ethnographic evidence, for example, it really strongly points to, is the strong likelihood that these individuals moving forward in their lives will hesitate before sending their children to college of any type. And I think that that's a cycle that will not be a virtuous one for us and that we'll be paying for. And I think that therefore it's, Washington's concerned about these sorts of things. There are other particular moments that I want to highlight for us in terms of history that should shape our thinking about whether this is the right policy at the right time. The first one is we are now at the 50th anniversary of the Higher Education Act of 1965, okay? So we've now been doing the current system and only one system, right? We've only tried one way of making college affordable during a period of massification of higher education, okay? And we've been doing that now, like I said, for 50 years. It is a voucher-based system. The Pell Grant is all about choice, and actually, as Stephen alluded to, 1 minute, geez. It's a means-tested system. I get a bonus? Okay, well, thank you. So I just want to point out what's happened, and this is from Sue Janarski and her colleague Martha Bailey at Michigan. Was somebody talking?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. I think you should be given 5 more minutes. You had more to say.
Okay, well, anyway, so I just want to show you what's happened in terms of the fraction of a birth cohort completing college by family income during the period of time in which we've had the current policy, right? And I take from this chart, as you can see here, that in fact, low-income folks are essentially running in place. So yes, an increase from 5 to 9% is actually rather substantial calculated in percentage terms, if not in percentage point terms. But you can see that in fact, the poor have fallen further behind under the current system, which costs an inordinate amount of money. Okay, and we can argue over whether, what is too much, but I do think in Washington that if we added up the total cost of the current federal financial aid system and we looked at the $100 billion number and we looked at this, we would have some real concerns. And that's what Andrew Kelly and I wrote a book on that I'm going to refer to later. So there's evident, the other thing that's important to remember, there's evident bipartisan interest in affordability at this moment. Okay? The state that the president traveled to, Tennessee, is governed by a Republican who put forth a free community college plan, following actually on the heels of Mississippi, which was also interested in this. At the same time that former governor, now John Kitzhaber of Oregon, a Democrat, was also pursuing it. I think those things are relevant. I believe that while we should consider opportunity costs of policies, I don't think that they are actually at play in the decision-making process in the way that we would perhaps as academics like them to be. There was literally no one, I can assure you, sitting there saying, there is X pot of money to spend on the disadvantaged. Let's choose among the following things. If you want to see what this looks like, you should look at President Obama's budget bill, which includes funding for all of the things that we might like to see, perhaps leaving out a few, but in fact includes all of that. And I believe that the best thing we can do if we're going to strengthen universal early childhood education and improve our K-12 system is to ensure that at the other end lie opportunities that people can actually take advantage of by also shoring up the community college system. I am also extremely unwilling to write off the future opportunities of adults who are long past those other reforms that we might be investing in. I believe that we do have the capacity in every which respect, both political and economic capacities, to act in all forms. And I believe that one of the lessons that we have seen, and this is, again, this is something we can debate, it's something that Theda Skocpol has written about and we've been talking about lately, that universal policies are going to be sustained over the long term far better than policies that are targeted to only the very poorest. And I believe that the transition in rhetoric from talking about Pell Grant recipients as hardworking individuals to those who are likened to welfare recipients, something that Katie Broughton's actually going to hopefully look at in her dissertation, I think that is a highlight that we cannot look past. That the federal Pell Grant program is in grave danger already, and that we're going to have to take some sort of action to shore up the affordability for these folks over the long haul. So I think there are many pay-fors here that are potential. I think that the numbers that Stephen put up, we sort of went back and forth over what number to use. We don't know what number to use because some of it's about how are you going to actually do this. My proposal with Nancy highlights what I would call waste in the current system. He referred to it as private school attendance. I'm not saying that they're a bad place to go. They're fine. I just don't understand why we as federal taxpayers subsidize attendance at institutions that directly compete with ours and drive up our costs. UW-Madison today would not be in the situation that it is in, seeking to raise its tuition if, frankly, our private school counterparts were not showing us how much money one could possibly spend on undergraduate education. Okay? This is now happening to our community colleges, to UW-Parkside, to Stout, et cetera. I also would say that if I had known that it was coming on the segregation piece, I would show you a fabulous chart that would show you that it's hard to get more segregated than we are today. Today's higher education system is so intensely segregated between opportunities at private and public colleges that, in fact, the concern I have is on the, quote, low end, which is the segregation of students into for-profit colleges and universities because the publics are unaffordable. And there's actually a very nice study that shows that what happens when we make a good investment in the public sector is the for-profit sector takes a downhill slide in terms of its enrollment. That's something that I think we need to enhance. So I think that the real discussion and debate, and indeed this is happening now in Washington, is about how to do this pay for and how, in fact, to make this program work as best it can. Now, there is tons of room for improvement. And this is where I'm spending my time right now, is what can we do to make this a better policy? So first, it needs to be simpler. I think the GPA requirements work against the effectiveness of this policy. If it's going to be means tested, you're going to lose my support for this policy. If it needs to be more inclusive, I do think we should add the public 4 years. And not the least, the best argument for that is there's a substantial number of students who are actually sitting on the margin between those 2-year colleges and those public 4-year institutions. And there's a growing body of evidence that, in fact, they may be harmed by pushing them towards the 2-year colleges. Although, again, that's sort of taking the status quo in terms of what the community colleges can deliver, and I think this will enhance their performance. I also believe it should be more flexible. 2 years is simply not the way that students think about college today. They think in terms of credits. And so I think that we need to do 60 credits even if it's spread over 4 years or whatever else like that. In terms of likely next steps that you should see and be thinking about, like I said before, there are legislators who are getting in this mix, including, I believe, probably our own senator here from Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin. We're going to see versions of this coming out from states, and they need advice about how to do this well at the state level, which is a very difficult thing to do without the federal resources. And frankly, the thing that I'm most hoping for is some sort of demonstration, because that is something that we have been lacking. For all the money we've spent in higher education, we very rarely get any sort of waiver authority to do any kind of demo. So I'm going to just leave that up there at the end. But I'm very excited for your questions and answers, and this was a blast. Please. Oh, yeah, please. Do you want to take?
Do you mind if I take a couple minutes on universalism?
How many are you giving it? He can take 2 minutes. Is that what, he asked me for 2 minutes, right? You want 3?
No, I
On universalism.
yeah, because that was the part that we didn't get to. So there again, we simply have a disagreement. My reading of the Scotch poll work is that I'm not persuaded history has ratified it. And what I mean by that is that it was very much motivated by the Reagan administration's, Reagan's coming to office and hostility to welfare. One of the many slides I skipped shows the per capita increases in wealth, or the growth of social welfare programs despite the Reagan Revolution. And so I think that some of Scotch poll's worries did not prove to be the case historically. Second comment, and this is where we would have a specific disagreement on the price, whether or not rich people ought to pay for it, is that I think that I put a lot of value on this ability to create an ethical consensus around something. And there's a word in addition to, or besides equality of opportunity, there's another concept which matters, and that is desert, whether people deserve things. And I think it's dangerous. I see worries that a program which would in principle give Bill Gates' kids a subsidy will be perceived as somehow rewarding people that are undeserving. There is good evidence, or there are good arguments made in various social science. Stan Bowles and Herb Gintis have argued that the failure of egalitarian policies to prevail has to do with, they give an evolutionary psychology interpretation, which I don't agree with, but the idea that people are very averse to policies where they think they're being cheated in some sense, or people are not fulfilling their obligations. And so one could also identify empirical evidence for that. The U.S. Army is often said to engage in supply side versus demand side affirmative action, and the lack of resentment to affirmative action among white soldiers. So these policies has to do with the fact that there's a co-payment of additional study. This is at least what Charles Moskos and John Sibley Butler have argued. Again, this is not a proof that this could not, that on this issue. The final things I will grumble about, not about you, but about President Obama. The reason I call it an empty proposal in that newspaper story was a couple of years ago, everything was about ECI. This was going to be the place where the publicity came, and I think it's much easier to get an ethical consensus on protecting children, because the same issue of desert and responsibility, all of that, it tends to attenuate with age. And so again, my judgment is that that's where the political feasibility is strongest. Okay, that's all. But again, this is talking about history.
Yep.
Okay, we have a lot of people in the room. We have about 20 minutes. You have to speak into the mic. So what I'm going to do is ask people to raise their hands on this side for a couple questions, and then I'll move to that side. Who's got questions over here? Introduce yourself and then ask.
All right. Howdy, y'all. I'm Catherine. I'm a fourth year in the economics department. I don't know anything about community college, so Sarah, I was wondering if you could talk about what kind of heterogeneity or variation there is in the quality of community college within certain geographies, because I think my hesitation for really just like being a big liberal and loving this plan is that we have universal high school, but it's an incredibly unequal production process, deliberatively so if you think of public finance. And so what would be the difference with community colleges and the way they're structured that we wouldn't just end up extending really unequal high school experiences for another 2 years?
Sure. I think it's a great question. I think that the comments about our current system are also important to address. So our current system is highly unequal, and in many ways it's being denigrated for not doing a great job. I still think there are many who would argue that, in fact, it's still very highly performing. We still do achieve quite a bit in our K-12 system. There's a long way to go, and we achieve different amounts for different people. In terms of the evidence on variation and quality among community colleges, I would say is not fabulous. The state of this field is not strong. And for those of you who are students who might want to jump into this field, I urge you to do so, because it's a very small and shallow water right now. So it's very difficult to distinguish the characteristics and organizational practices of our colleges from the people who populate them, right? And the data sets that we have available have very few variables with which to measure these things. So, I mean, there are certainly people who I would say are the ethnographers of the community colleges who would say there's a great deal of variation. But many of them have a very hard time disentangling, like I said, the organizational practices of those schools from the fact that the quote-unquote worst performing, low-quality community colleges in this country are located located in highly segregated, very impoverished communities. They receive very little funding. And so there have been sort of high flyer studies, right, where they try to find two schools that look demographically the same. One of them beats the other. But again, I find these studies to be very unconvincing. They're typically the case that somebody's overlooking some really important forms of heterogeneity. So, you know, it's possible, sure, that we would engage some students in some lousy schools. But I think overall on the whole, we're not going to do that any sort of more than we're already doing it now. I guess that's part of what I'm arguing.
Hi, Don Moynihan, La Follette School. I think this is directed to Steve. Steve, you made the claim about whether zero was different as a price point, and you seem to cast some doubt about it. I'd like to push against that idea a little bit because we know something about woodworking effects. So if you announce that there's some new policy, people who didn't know about it before just sort of come out of the woodwork, even if they were previously eligible. And we also know from the Hawksby and Avery work on missing one-offs that especially poor people tend to have a very low level of knowledge about the actual cost of going to college. And so having this big Obama free community college label might pull out some of those people in a way that's different from simply reducing the cost of community college by $1,000 or giving someone better financial aid.
So one problem with the slide was I had made a guess about what Sarah was going to say, and it was really saying, in addition to what her position, her arguments were, these were the other factors. So I agree that that's worth thinking about. A different argument is that an argument Sarah has made is the credibility of financial aid promises is not high for people who are disadvantaged and have experienced, you know, a plethora of injustices in the course of their lives. So what I would like to have on the table are two questions, one or 2 points. One of them is the possibility of creating credible changes, and that's what I referred to as the graduated tuition plan, which actually, and the slide also had negative tuition in it. So the idea was if you were disadvantaged enough, you got a subsidy, but everything was kind of fixed by law. The second point, and what I wanted to say was that this issue of zero, there are different ways to think about it. One of them is it's salient. Mm-hmm. A different one is that the act of making a financial contribution may change the way that the interactions transpire between the student and the college, so that I thought that I just want those on the table, and at least in my mind, you know, from what I know from the experimental economics literature and other places, I don't have a way of a priori tilting one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Okay, over on this side.
My name is Nino Amato, and I want to thank you both for having this forum. I wish I was at the state capitol. I might have appreciated it more. By way of disclaimer, I serve as chair on the Hope Lab board. I'm an alum of the School of Education, did my master's at the La Follette Institute, worked within the university system as the director of business outreach and technology transfer, served on the board of regents, and was president of the technical college system board. Let me take the empirical data, followed by your global competitive effect, followed by what I would call, and I think you mentioned earlier, the income cost effect, and then what should be a income substitution effect. Empirical data. Germany, strongest economy in the European market, stronger than Eastern European. They provide free education. Japan, one of the strongest economies in the Asian market. Their education is much more affordable and much more accessible. If you take Finland, free education. If you take Denmark, they actually provide $900 a month for every eligible student to go to school for 6 years, living cost. My point is this: if you look at the US, what we do is we charge student loans 10 times that of what we charge bankers. We then, if you don't pay those student loans off, we garnish your wages, and many of those kids have parents who co-sign who are now in retirement, and they're garnishing their wages. And then if you have the gall to have bankruptcy, you have to pay that off. So in essence, we're creating a generation of indentured servants for the next 15 to 20 years. Cost effect. If you look at what's going on in this country in 1952, over 32% of the federal revenues came from major corporations. Last year, less than 10%, and 1 out of 4 major corporations didn't pay any income tax whatsoever, specifically General Electric. Fact, and income effect. Governor Doyle and Governor Walker both have failed this university. He cut the budget by $250 million, raised tuition by 37.5%, and Walker cut it by $250 plus another $300 million. In fairness to Doyle, he appreciates college education. I don't know if this governor does from dropping out of school. My question is, why not bring the economics department, the School of Education, La Follette Institute, and the sociology department to craft a program that will work for Wisconsin and for the feds, and march up State Street like we used to do decades ago and make our case and get
Wanna
the
march?
families and people involved?
You want to respond?
It's hard to respond, to be honest, because I don't actually agree with a lot of the facts you put on the table, at least your interpretations. The fact that Denmark and Finland have free education, that tells us nothing, in my view, about the United States. Why do I say that? Because typically we hear, oh yes, Finland, Norway, Denmark, extremely mobile compared to America based on correlations of parents and offspring. Well, you take those countries, you introduce immigrants the way we've done for 100, 200 years, and tell me, would they have had as much success? And so it's not to be disrespectful, but the heterogeneity.
Okay, just use Germany as an example.
Yeah.
They have an immigration policy that's even better than ours. And Germany's a strong economy. So there is a huge difference. So throw out the other small.
And if we were having this discussion in 1987, Germany and Japan don't sit here with the United States here. They have been relative successes, have moved up and down. And and this is something, I have a stake in this, because I've written many papers on cross-country behavior, which they tend to be negative in the sense they say that there's so much heterogeneity in these countries that we can't really draw very many conclusions from them. So I'm really, I'm sorry, as I said, I don't want to be rude, but the facts themselves, I just don't agree that they speak to policy here.
I think what's interesting about where we do agree on this a bit is that I think one of the struggles the country is having around affordability is driven by its composition, right? I mean, it's not just immigrants, right? It's the whole history of racial inequity in the country. And that I think that piece about who we have in the country, right? And our struggles to provide things, to take care of other people's children in any which way, coupled with the fact that we have a much more inclusive higher education system, right? One in which it offers lots of second chances, which Germany's system does not, right? And other systems do not, make this a more difficult thing to sort of find the right financing mix that gets political support, right? Because in other words, a lot of what Germany does that I think is really relevant here is a lot of sort of sifting of people well before higher education. And I think that goes to your point about the degree to which people view them as deserving, therefore, once they get there. They don't sort of question in the same way, should we finance this person who all they've done is pass through, essentially, barely got through high school and have entered our colleges. I think the similar kind of conversation is about why did we understand that living costs should be covered when we sent our GIs to college under the original GI Bill. And today, when anybody talks about should living costs be part of what's packaged in financial aid, people say, wait, what is that? Why would we ever do that, right? It's because they are really clearly deserving and they've earned something. And so I think, but I think what's fruitful, I think Nino's reflecting a very common sort of thinking about this including among our policymakers that I also hear. And so it's something that we have to continue to speak to at the very least.
I was going
Yep.
to say, follow the German model.
Sure.
The fact is, it is competitive, and somehow they can do it with their economy.
Oh, I'm sorry. So let me be clear. I don't have any reason whatsoever to believe that Sarah's policy, the Obama policy, that these would make the economy less competitive. That's all I wanted to put on the table is that things like competitiveness are sufficiently complicated. There's no lesson to draw from the cross-country comparisons. For what it's worth, I'm also very nervous about them for a different reason. I think the case for reforming financial aid, which of course also involves loans that are less predatory, not just making something free, all of reducing cost levels, et cetera, all of that, the strongest cases to me are ethical. We have a vision, a consensus in the United States about opportunity. And it worries me to then introduce a fact that I think is contestable, as in, if you make these reforms, the growth rate will increase or decrease. That's not I think the ethical argument we can win. The empirical ones, as I said, I have enormous the literature on these things is not succeeded.
And what's fascinating, of course, is that the president went down the other road in pitching this, right? He turns time and time again to the global competitiveness, cross-country comparisons, all the race that we're in, and not to the ethical whenever making these arguments. So, yeah.
Francis Schrag, Professor Emeritus in Sarah's department. I think this question is more for you, Sarah. I see the need for the 2.5 for retention, but I'm worried about two things. One is, does this give an incentive to the community colleges to inflate their grades, to keep getting the money? Mm-hmm. Or the other problem is, won't the most challenged students, the ones from the toughest backgrounds, be the ones who are not going to return for the second year and would increase the segregation?
Yeah, I have to say that I believe that he instituted the 2.5 in order to use the word hardworking when pitching the plan. And again, it has everything to do with deservingness. So I think if you look at the body of evidence that we have from both quantitative and qualitative work, you would not put a GPA requirement like that into place. Number one, because there's fairly strong evidence that, yes, of course, it will essentially take financial assistance away from the students who most need it in order to get good grades, rendering them far less likely to complete school. Second, there's very little evidence that such requirements actually increase motivation in higher education, partly, I would argue, because students are very unaware of the requirements, and when they are, they don't know what to do about them. So this has to do with the plethora of choices in higher education, the degree to which we tell students that they should explore their options and take multiple majors and things. They have a very hard time juggling credits and grade trade-offs. One of my very favorite studies that's out there is by colleagues at the University of Georgia that looked at what happened under the Georgia Hope program, which is a merit program that does have this requirement in there that students get a 3.0 in order to keep getting their money. And in fact, they've found two different things. Number one is that students will respond by taking easier courses and majoring in easier subjects. So this program that was introduced by conservatives actually seems to have reduced success in STEM, which I'm sure the state of Georgia can't be happy about. And secondly, yes, that it does provide incentives to institutions and to faculty, maybe not so much proactively to respond by saying, I will be easier, but to respond to the begging and pleading of students who will rightfully come to them and say, you're going to cost me my financial aid. And I know that that's already happens among our colleagues on campus. They already hear this sort of thing. But I think the lessons that we will get from the growing body of research on SAP, which is the Satisfactory Academic Progress Standard in place for the Pell Grant, is going to add to this. And hopefully, I'd love to see that thing taken out of there. I worry, though, that politically, right, that any consensus around this starts to fall apart when you lift performance requirements.
Hi, I'm Luke. I'm an undergraduate sociology major. My concern has to do more with the greater political and budget constraints that we have. Professor Goldrick-Robb, you mentioned that this has some bipartisan support, and I was thinking about that. And like the program in Tennessee, for instance, follows massive cuts to their higher education system, their four-year universities. Governor Haslam's pursuing neoliberal education reform in the K-12 system. And particularly because the proposal has a significant portion from state funds, what is the effect going to be on a lot of other programs that we care about?
I think those are great questions. I don't like that the Tennessee program is funded with a lottery, just like I don't like the idea of stabilizing higher education funding using a sales tax. Right? So I think we should worry about those things. I think some of what you're seeing there is behavior of states when they want to do something ambitious and they don't have the resources really to do it. And the federal government, unfortunately, has been unwilling to partner with them to give them waiver authority to enable them, for example, to use existing funds differently so that they could play with these things. The one thing I didn't really get to was the sort of time horizon point here. I don't think this proposal has been introduced to be passed by this Congress right now with our existing resources. I think that just like there was a very long road to making public secondary education free, right? A road that I believe is approximately 80 years long, based on my reading of my colleague Bill Reese's history of this, that we need to start now if we want to see anything like this, frankly, I don't even know about my lifetime, but by the time my kids have kids. I think that matters, and I think that it's also worth noting that you're right about, I guess, what you've termed neoliberal trends in education, and you're right about reductions in state funding, but I also want to say that that's not uniform across the country, right? In fact, Wisconsin right now stands out for its movement in a certain direction in opposition to many other states that are actually reinvesting. So I have to wonder if this creates part of a turnaround, and also, by the way, if we can engage more of the middle and upper class in thinking about our public system, whether that in fact would also help to contribute to momentum in terms of investment back into that system.
Okay, we have time for one short question, and Bob promises it's short.
But what about the answer?
You get the answer this time.
Great presentation from both of you. I was surprised that the issue of private for-profit colleges didn't come up until late in the discussion. In my view, the biggest cancer on both efficiency and equity grounds in the higher education system is the private for-profit college sector. One of the impacts of this proposal is that it makes community colleges more attractive relative to the private for-profit option. And anything, in my view, that can be done to siphon traffic away from that private for-profit sector has advantages. I should have introduced myself. I'm Bob Haveman, La Follette School and Economics.
Well, that's actually an issue where I probably have a harder line view than you, because I think the for-profits are despicable. So what I'd like to do is cut off any financial aid that goes to them as a start.
Thank you.
So I don't.
I would firmly agree with you, but I would also not say it. If you want to kill the policy, keep saying that. I mean, that's what I can tell you, is that is one of the single best ways to activate one of the most powerful lobbying forces in the country against this policy. These folks spend more money on advertising than Coca-Cola does. So, this is about learning, I think 5 years ago I would have shouted out from the rooftops, and I won't anymore.
I guess that's why I yelled it now.
Well, let's give them a final round of applause.
That's really fun.
So,